A few months ago, I received a phone call from the United States, and it was from a well-known reporter for one of the leading newspapers. And he asked me this question: Mr. Brandt, can you help me find the Holy Grail? The Holy Grail is considered to be the vessel that Jesus used as the Last Supper to serve the wine. And it first appeared in the 12th century in the so-called Arthurian literature, stories about the legendary King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. People have been searching for this object ever since, especially, of course, after Dan Brown's bestseller, The Da Vinci Code. Most people would probably hang up if somebody called them with such a question. After all, what proves that there was such a thing as the Holy Grail? Some text about King Arthur? Yeah, right. And indeed, there is no historical evidence that King Arthur ever existed. That, by the way, did not withhold my parents from naming me after him. So why did I not hang up? And how was it possible that a very respected journalist called an ordinary Dutch guy like myself, asking him to help him search for the Holy Grail? In order to answer that, I will take you back to my teenage years. I was what one would call a daydreamer. I stared out of the school window, imagining what my life was going to be. Would I write that ultimate novel? Would I discover something that could help mankind? But slowly, a very unpleasant feeling got hold of me. Hadn't everything already been said and done? After all these great philosophers, these writers, these scientists, what new ideas could one possibly develop? Of course, I could sail out like Columbus to find a new world, but it all had been done. My best friends at school did not have such depressing thoughts. Contrary to me, they were real whiz kids with a huge talent for science, like physics and chemistry. And during when a science practicum had to be carried out, I watched them do things about which I had not the slightest clue. And in the meantime, they discussed all these great mysteries in mathematics, in physics, that still were waiting to be solved. And they were convinced that one day they would do exactly that, solve these mysteries. But what was there for me, for people like me, who are no whiz kids? I decided to become an exchange student and figure that out. Together with a friend of mine, I went to live in Spain, southern Spain. As we did not speak a word of Spanish yet, we couldn't watch television. It was useless, of course. But luckily, my friend had one videotape of a movie in English called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's a famous spaghetti western, thank you. It was a famous spaghetti western starring Lee Van Cleef, Clint Eastwood, and Eli Wallach. It's about three men who are searching for a treasure. And the final scene, most of you probably know this scene, takes place on a cemetery with hundreds of graves. And in one of these graves, this huge treasure should be hidden. In that final scene, Lee Van Cleef has already been shot, and Clint and Eli are standing there on that cemetery in front of each other in the burning sun. And they know that one of them has to do the dirty and unpleasant job of digging for the treasure. Clint has a gun, Eli does not. And then Clint says to Eli, showing his gun, "You see, in this world there's two kinds of people, my friend. Those with loaded guns and those who dig. You dig." Two kinds of people. At the time I couldn't agree more. There were indeed two kinds of people. Those whiz kids, who one day might make an important discovery, and the rest of us who dig. We watched that movie over and over again because there was nothing else to do. Afterwards, we normally would go and sit on the balcony at about 1 o'clock in the morning. On some of these nights, we saw some gypsy men get into their cars with spades and torches. And finally, one night, I dared to ask. I bowed over the balcony and whispered in broken Spanish, "Where are you hombres going?" They looked up, puzzled by this blonde guy, this foreigner, and then one of them answered, "We are going to dig." I said, "Dig? What do you mean dig?" "Well, you know, treasure hunting. Wanna come?" Of course, I accepted the invitation because treasure hunting sounded like Indiana Jones from the Hollywood movies, the professor of archaeology who gets involved in all kinds of adventures while searching for long lost treasures. I got in the car and I sat on the back seat, squeezed in between two gypsies, and I had never been in touch with any gypsy before, and they had never met what in their eyes was this blonde guy, this foreigner, this giant from some country far north. So there I was, in the middle of the night, in some desert in southern Spain, digging by the light of torches. That night, we found 3 Roman silver coins about 2,000 years old. And here you see one of them similar to this one. Who had lost these coins? Had it been a Roman soldier? And I was fascinated. For the first time in my life, I realized that even for people like me, there still remained a lot to discover. And I decided that my future should be marked by investigating the past. And even if I would never discover anything important, it didn't matter, because in essence, my purpose was about learning, about being curious, about enjoying everything around me, the world around me. And you can find the same joy in, for example, a poem or a piece of music, or by watching the universe through a telescope. As said, I decided to dedicate my life to the past. And that includes archaeology and art. And I soon discovered that there are 2 kinds of people in the art world: those who can be trusted and those who are con men. A third of everything on the art market is fake, and most likely as much as 10% of everything on display in museums. And there is such a thing that could be called the art mafia, some 20 men who control the entire illicit art market. These people, according to the CIA, these people control not only the entire illicit art market, but this illicit art market is the 3rd largest criminal activity in the world after drugs and weapons. I searched through newspapers and I looked for articles about huge art scandals, and I wrote down the names of the people that were mentioned in it. And at art auctions, where these people meet and do their business, I introduced myself to them. And as I was very willing to learn and eager to discover something big, I soon got to know these guys better. Of course, at first they laughed at me because I didn't seem to pose any threat to them, and they even compared me to Peter Sellers in his role as Inspector Clouseau, the French inspector who didn't even notice a crime when it occurred in front of his face. But gradually they started to take me more serious as I started to receive threats. And receiving threats is always a good sign for being on the right track of something that should remain hidden. And in the years to come, I got involved in some major stories and some major mysteries. As an example of how you solve such a mystery, I will tell you about my latest discovery. It made headlines all over the world a few months ago. In several newspapers, it was declared to be one of the most interesting finds in decades. And this discovery had caused the American journalists, with which I began my story, to ask me to help him search for the Holy Grail. And I will try to explain how it was possible that an ordinary Dutch guy succeeded in something that no one else had been able to do. And you will see that many of you could have done it. All it required were persistence, curiosity, and the will to learn in the process. 2 years ago, one of my informants sent me this picture. He said, "Arthur, somebody is trying to sell these statues on the black market." I immediately recognized these statues as the so-called walking horses that had been made by Joseph Thorak, one of Adolf Hitler's favorite sculptors. The horses once stood in the garden of the Chancellery in Berlin, next to Hitler's office. Probably one of the most prominent places, of course, in the Third Reich. Here you can see one of these horses standing at the Reichschancellery. The other horse is on the other side of the terrace. On the left you see Hitler's office, where he planned to conquer the world. At about 100 meters from these horses, Hitler's bunker was located, where he later would commit suicide together with Eva Braun. So these two horses witnessed the Second World War start and end. I stared at this color picture. The horses looked fabulous, but there was one slight problem. The original horses, that was common knowledge, had been destroyed in 1945 during the Battle of Berlin, when Russian troops fought their way to the Chancellery. So these two statues had to be reproductions, fakes, forgeries. I'm sure that most people, knowing that these statues were fake, would not have taken any action, but I was intrigued. Was the seller really that stupid to think that anyone would spend millions on some forgeries? And what had happened to the original horses? Okay, they had been destroyed, but when and how? In the next months, I tried to solve this mystery, and I looked at everything I could find about the last days of Adolf Hitler. And of course, I also watched the famous footage, the last footage of Adolf Hitler, shot 1 month before his suicide. Probably you have all seen this footage, as you can see it in every documentary about the Third Reich. On March 22nd, Adolf Hitler for the last time leaves his bunker to greet his last soldiers, some kids from the Hitlerjugend. This is this footage.
Der Führer empfängt in seinem Hauptquartier den Reichsjugendführer Axmann mit einer Abordnung von 20 Hitlerjungen, die sich bei der Verteidigung ihrer Heimat besonders bewährt haben und dafür mit dem Eisernen Kreuz ausgezeichnet wurden.
So this is the last footage of Adolf Hitler. And I mentioned before that people had compared me to Inspector Clouseau, who couldn't even recognize a clue even if it hit him in the face. And they were right, because I had to watch this footage several times before I understood that the key to solving the mystery of what had happened to Hitler's horses was right there in front of my eyes. I want you to take a look at it again, and now watch at the images, don't read the subtitles.
Der Führer empfängt in seinem Hauptquartier den Reichsjugendführer Axmann mit einer Abordnung von 20 Hitlerjungen, die sich bei der Verteidigung ihrer Heimat besonders bewährt haben und dafür mit dem Eisernen Kreuz ausgezeichnet wurden.
I had never realized that this famous last footage of Adolf Hitler was shot in the garden of the Chancellery, in the garden where the horses of Hitler were standing. And now look at this still. In the circle you see one of Adolf Hitler's bodyguard at the exact same spot where one of the horses should be. And as you can see, there is no horse. And when you look to the left, you see that the Chancellery still looks undamaged. So this could only mean one thing. Before the start of the Battle of Berlin, Hitler had ordered the horses to be removed. And that would mean that the horses on the color picture were most likely not fakes, but the real ones. Can you imagine how I felt? The treasures of Adolf Hitler, thought to be destroyed, were still around after 70 years. Together with a friend of mine, a journalist from the German magazine Der Spiegel, we investigated this whole story. And we discovered that Hitler indeed had moved the horses out of Berlin because he was afraid that they would be damaged. The town that they were taken to was later conquered by the Russian Red Army, and we discovered that the Russians had confiscated these horses and had later placed them on one of their military compounds in occupied East Germany, where they remained hidden until 1989. We even managed to dig up some private pictures of Russian soldiers posing with the horses. We had one of a Russian soldier peeing to the horses, but I prefer to show these two ones. When the wall that divided the capitalist West and the communist East fell in 1989, the Russians had to get rid of these statues because it would have been a huge scandal if the West found out that the communists had been hiding and admiring the National Socialistic statues for more than 3 or 4 decades. And somehow the man who was offering them now for sale with his color pictures had managed to obtain possession of them. As these horses were, even after 70 years, still German state property and should be saved for future generations and scholars, I decided to contact the German police. And together, we decided that we should set up a sting operation. Of course, I could not call the seller and bluntly ask him for the horses, so I made up a story. I called him and I told him that I represented a wealthy American collector. This non-existing client I modeled after J.R., the famous Texas oil baron in the television soap Dallas back in the 80s. And I know it now sounds ridiculous, but at the time I could not come up with something better. I called the seller and he said, well, what is your client interested in? And I said, well, he's very rich, Mr. Moss, and he collects everything as long as it is unique and there is an interesting story attached to it. And then there was this silence. And then he answered, well, in that case, I might have something interesting for him. That night, he mailed me the same picture I already had with the horses, so he had fallen into my trap. In the next week, we met a few times, and it turned out that the seller represented a network of elderly Germans with Nazi sympathies. And to my surprise, they did not only have the horses, but many more statues that once adorned the chancellery. And everybody thought that they had been destroyed. You might recognize some of these statues because you see them in all the documentaries about the Third Reich. And together with the horses, these statues once formed the most important artworks of the dark era in history, of which everybody thought that they had been destroyed. I managed to gain the confidence of this man, and finally he gave me the names and the addresses of the people that he represented. And in May this year, the German police raided about 15 locations all across Germany. By telephone, I was in direct contact with them, and finally, after some nerve-wracking hours, the head of operations yelled in my ear, Arthur, we found the horses. And at the moment that the horses were taken away by the police, more than 100 journalists with cameras were there. And on the day of this raid, the seller was on holiday in Greece. Obviously, someone had called him, telling him, look, we had a raid and the horses had been seized. But somehow he didn't cut it, because he called me from the beach in Greece in his swimming trunks, and he said, Arthur, you won't believe it. The horses have been seized. Someone must have leaked to the police. And I said, but now we cannot sell the horses anymore to your client, Mr. Moss. But I have some other stuff for him. Also illegal. Do you think he is interested? So I was there with his phone and I said, well, you never know. These statues, including the horses and the rest that you have seen, will be displayed next year in Berlin. So if you want to have a look, please go there. So how come that an ordinary Dutch guy like myself was able to do something that no one else had been able to do? Well, there are these whiz kids with a loaded gun in the form of a super brain. So let the rest of us try to learn. Let's use our amazement about the world around us to become an Indiana Jones in our own right. And it doesn't have to be mysteries or discoveries as big as the horses. Even to try and understand the meaning of a poem is like solving a mystery. And there are indeed two kinds of people, but not the whiz kids and those who are not whiz kids. Not the haves and the have-nots like those gypsies. No, the two kinds of people are those who are curious about the world around them and those who just don't care. And you, being here, attending all these lectures, eager to be informed and to learn something, you belong to that first group. Thank you.